Thank you, Ishwara-san. Great pleasure to be here, and let me compliment the National Institute for Defense Studies (NIDS) for the 70th anniversary, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking in the Security Symposium here, and great to be here with the panelists, some of the finest scholars on the subject. Yes, as you rightly mentioned, let me give a background to my talk as I will provide an Indian perspective, but I must make it clear that, this is just an Indian perspective. I'm based right now in Europe, in Stockholm, and the way I look at it, the security situation, the global security situation. So most of my views are mostly independent analytical views, and therefore my views should be seen more as an independent and analytical in terms of from a scholarly point of view rather than from any institutional point of view. While saying that, I think two debates which have dominated in Europe right now, and that also affects India and Japan, more prominently at the current security situation, is the Ukraine issue, the war in Ukraine, and then the Taiwan issue, the Taiwan crisis. As you know, both of these issues are being monitored, debated, and discussed among the world community very closely. So I think it makes sense from Japan's point of view, from India's point of view, and from the Indo-Pacific point of view to discuss about these issues. And while I am based there in Europe, very often I hear the kind of argument that now the Ukraine has happened, and probably next Taiwan will happen. I correct to my fellow colleagues in European strategic circuit, and I hold my view by saying that we should not unnecessarily draw a parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan. And my talk is about that. And therefore, let me share my views. Why do I say that the Ukraine war is slightly different from the Taiwan crisis? And what are the rationale behind it? And how should we see it, particularly from Japanese point of view, from Indian point of view, and from the Indo-Pacific region? How should we draw or should not draw the parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan? And therefore, if you see, next slides, please. If you see, my structure of the presentation is, and I'll be addressing some of the questions, these questions are mostly relevant from Japan's point of view and India's point of view, from the security of the Indo-Pacific. That the questions are like, what are the cases that encourage us to draw a parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan? And at the same time, what are the cases that does not really encourage us to draw a parallel? And I think that needs to be understood clearly, because if we understand clearly, then most of our future planning, strategic thoughts with regard to provide a security to Taiwan, including upgrading security for Japan and security for India, will be in order. And then I'll be talking about to what extent Ukraine is a proxy for Taiwan. Of course, there is a linkages. We cannot really, delink the Ukraine crisis from Taiwan crisis. There is a huge set of strategic linkages is there. But is it really a kind of a proxy background we are witnessing? Then I'll be talking about how the Chinese are looking at it, how the Chinese are actually looking at the Ukraine crisis, and they would be looking at the Taiwan crisis, and how should India and Japan should be prepared for that. And then I'll be talking about Taiwan security and the Indo-Pacific security, and then I'll be seeing that to what extent China might take a military adventure in times to come on the Taiwan issue. Next slides, please. And I think if you see the questions are quite pertinent. And I think the first questions is that, what can be made of the drawing of parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan? And I think that is a very common question, but a very complicated questions. As I mentioned, I think these questions has a relevance for Japan, for Taiwan, for India, for the Indo-Pacific, but also it has a relevance for the larger European community at a time when Europe is having its own Indo-Pacific strategy, and at a time when the European community for the first time looks a bit united. And I think what the Ukraine war has done, it has brought the entire European community under a united umbrella. We know for a fact that EU has a lot of countries under it, 26 to 27 countries are member under EU. And within EU, within European Union, and within the continent of the Europe, there are a large number of issues, complicated issues, where many European countries do not agree with each other. So therefore, I think what is interesting here to see that how the Ukraine war has actually brought the European community under a singular umbrella. And for the first time, I think after the end of the Second World War, or after a long time, for the first time, the European communities are looking much more united when it comes to security issues and foreign policy issues in the grander global context. And I think we know for a fact that probably European countries will never have a united vision plan because their approach on China differs from each other. The Europe is divided. There are countries, those who are pro-China and anti-China. There are countries within Europe, they are pro-US, anti-US. So there will be a division of vision plan when it comes to European Union. But within that divided vision plan, I think there is a larger consensus that is emerging that Russia is a enemy from the past, and Russia is here to stay as an enemy. But I think the European communities are looking at the future, and to that context, they see China as a future threat. And I think there we need to, while drawing a parallel between Ukraine and Taiwan, it makes sense. We also need to differentiate between the Ukraine crisis and the Taiwan crisis. The second question, which is very pertinent here, is that is it justifiable or needed to ascertain a level of deterrence or preparation measures against China? Or it is an exercise in futility or sensationalism that we are creating. And I think this issue also needs a greater clarity for the Indo-Pacific countries, for Japan, for India, including for Taiwan. And I think there we need a strategic clarity to what extent we need to build a strategic deterrence against China and whether we'll be successful or not. The third question that actually matters is that to what extent would China count on lessons from Ukraine? And to what extent actually China would employ the lessons drawing from the Ukraine war and seeing Russia and Ukraine fighting closely, and then to what extent it will employ its strategy and tactics accordingly on the Taiwan issue or on the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that is another critical question that we need to know. And then can the Indo-Pacific states like India and Japan recalibrate their Taiwan stand for greater regional goods? And I think that is another critical questions that we need to really talk about. Next slides, please. And I think let me first address the first questions, which is whether it makes sense to draw a parallel between the Ukraine and Taiwan. I think, of course, there are some similarities. If we see the case of Ukraine, it's a democratic country. If we see Taiwan, it is a democratic region. It is a democratic entity, and there is, they have been the advocate of free market economy. So this war, in a way, speaks about how the authoritarian powers are being heavy on the democratic powers. So there is a similarity. And also, if you see the case of Ukraine and Taiwan, even though we are talking here about the two different geographies, but the case here is almost, the same. Ukraine is surrounded by very powerful neighbors and authoritarian powers. So is the case of Taiwan. In the case of Ukraine, it is Russia. In the case of Taiwan, it is China. And I think there is a similarity. And this similarity is more about how the authoritarian powers are viewing democratic powers and how the authoritarian powers using the repressive measures against the democratic powers. But at the same time, and I think we should not draw this parallel unnecessarily, because there is a huge difference between Ukraine and Taiwan in terms of geography, in terms of power politics, in terms of war tactics. And I think that needs to be understood. I think if we see the Ukraine issue and the Taiwan issue, they are of a different geographic zone. Ukraine is, Russia's war with Ukraine is more of a land border, land border fighting or land border war issues. Whereas Taiwan issue would be a complicated game. It would be more of a maritime adventure of the PLA. So therefore, I think here, when we are talking about Taiwan, we need to see that we are talking about a more of a maritime and air-based strategy from People's Liberation Army. And therefore, we need to really prepare for that. And the second is, when we're talking about Taiwan and Ukraine, we need to understand that Ukraine is a complete, state. It's a sovereign state, whereas the Taiwan case is a weaker one. Taiwan is not really a state, a sovereign state, but definitely there is a case of sovereignty can be made in the context of Taiwan, because it is about national territorial integrity of Taiwan. There is a huge population is there. It's an independent island, and therefore we need to also talk about how the Taiwan issue will unfold in future in terms of response to China's aggression. And therefore Taiwan's case is very unique because it is an island which is situated at the center of the Indian Ocean or the Pacific Ocean. It is at the center of the Indo-Pacific region. It is closely linked with Japan, Southeast Asian communities, including India and the Southeast Asian communities. So the unique position of Taiwan defines the Indo-Pacific security in some ways. So therefore, the Ukraine war can be a lesson, can be observed very quickly, but we should not draw abrupt parallels from the Ukraine war on the case of Taiwan. But at the same time, when we are talking about the Taiwan case, and from Japan's point of view, India's point of view, this is very critical, because a danger to Taiwan security or military occupation over Taiwan exposes dearly Japan's security, national security, some of the Southeast Asian countries' security, including India's security. We know that if PLA occupies Taiwan, then India's Bay of Bengal region will be directly exposed. And that is where both India and Japan needs to have a much more common strategy and commonality of understanding when it comes to the Taiwan issue. Next slides, please. I think one of the aspects that in the global community today, particularly from the American thinkers and strategists, that is coming to discussion is that when we are talking about the Chinese invention of Taiwan, many U.S. military experts deny the fact that there won't be any imminent attack from the PLA or imminent military invention from China on Taiwan. And their logic is because of the geography, because of the economics, because of the politics. Geography, they say that they argue that Taiwan is a unique region. It is it is having its own military, and also it is a unique island where many of the Indo-Pacific countries might support Taiwan geographically when it comes to the maritime domain. So Taiwan might get a lot of naval support, maritime support, if there is a military invention is happening. So therefore, the Chinese are buying time. There won't be immediate invention. Then there is also an argument which is being made that there is an economic argument that the Chinese would not really go for an immediate occupation of Taiwan because it will affect the Chinese economy. While this is true, but there are also other aspects that needs to be taken into account. The third reason is that the argument which is being made that if China attacks Taiwan, then China will politically get a very bad image internationally. But all of these arguments has its own merit. But I would argue, I think, even though I do not really say that the PLA is going to occupy Taiwan immediately, but China's target with regard to occupying Taiwan has definitely been, shortened. Earlier, we could see that probably China would have envisioned to occupy Taiwan, 15 to 20 years from now on. But I would say that maybe in next 5 to 7 years, this is a very crucial period for Taiwan, since the PLA is aiming for an occupation of Taiwan. Now, what is my logic here, and how do I say that the Chinese or the PLA is going to occupy Taiwan? I don't think that the PLA is going to have a military attack on Taiwan, the kind of attack we see from Russia on Ukraine. And I think here we will see that PLA going for an incremental military occupation of Taiwan. What do I mean by incremental military occupation? Incremental military occupation is a narrative that the Chinese are building for a long time. One, they are building in the South China Sea, militarizing the South China Sea islands, and they are continuing to do that. During the pandemics, they have done that, and they will likely proceed with that militarization process in the South China Sea. Second, they would also like to do the same in the cross-strait region. Particularly, they would aim to occupy the Fengku Island and the Kinmen Island in the cross-strait region. And that is a step-by-step approach that the Chinese are building. So therefore, what we will see that an incremental military approach to occupy the key islands in the cross-strait region. And then in a couple of years, in the 2-3 years, the Chinese will go in terms of occupying or doing a naval circle or military encirclement on Taiwan. So therefore, what is the rationale behind occupying it state by state and going incrementally? The rationale is the Chinese are actually drawing heavy lessons from the Ukraine war. They are actually learning a lot of lessons. One, they are learning operational strategic lessons. We know for a fact that if we study the behavior of the PLA and the experience of the PLA, as National Institute of Defense Studies is a Ministry of Defense funded think tank, and I have engaged with them previously, and I am a very keen follower of NIDS writings on China and Indo-Pacific. I've seen some of these writings have also appeared in NIDS booklet, and I would definitely recommend our listener here to read NIDS report. I think the Chinese are learning operational strategy because the PLA's history is problematic. PLA has never had that war fighting experience all this while. After the 1962 war against India, PLA had never had a combat experience, a kind of war fighting experience. So the PLA is learning lessons dearly from Russia's invention on Ukraine. The second, I think, if we take into account PLA's behavior towards India, PLA's behavior towards Japan, PLA's behavior towards the South China Sea countries, there are local fights that PLA has orchestrated. And these local fights are, of course, for different purposes, for different motives. But then these local fights, the PLA have orchestrated, keeping in mind that the soldiers get adequate training how to face a adversary. And I'll just share with you one example. If we take the reference of 2017 Doklam incident, when Indian military went across the international line of control and stood for 73 days in the Doklam region facing PLA. PLA was clueless how to respond. Of course, PLA could have responded, but responding to Indian military would derail a lot of things in China and for Chinese military. And therefore, even though there were 73 days tensions in the Doklam region, the PLA did not respond hard to enter into a battle with India. And the same kind of case also we saw during the Galwan period with India. Even though there were, fight between Indian soldiers and Chinese soldiers, there were small casualties, but these were only casualties at the local level. It was not a war. There were standoffs, there were localized war, but it was not a major war. So therefore, PLA is training itself from different war experience, from local conditions to the warfare conditions. And I think they are also heavily drawing lessons from Ukraine. The other operational strategy is the battlefield experiences. If we see, I think Russia is struggling at this moment to sustain the war. I was there in Moscow a couple of weeks back, and I was talking to the Russian colleagues there. They don't know how to stop the war. Putin has lost all channel of communications in Ukraine, in European Union, and the only channel of communication for the Russians at this moment is China. But China has lost the face in Europe because the way the Chinese have supported the Russian war on Ukraine, and the European community do not want to, talk to the Chinese about the Ukraine war, and therefore there is a gap. And I think this is what the Chinese are also learning, that what if tomorrow they conduct a military attack on Taiwan? What about the international community, stop talking to China or engaging with China? Of course, there are smaller countries, they will continue to stay engaged with China, but China will, as a major power, will have a bad image to its peaceful campaigning that the Xi Jinping is talking about, for a long time. Then the other learning experience for PLA and for China here is the diplomatic repercussions. And I think if China forcefully attack and occupies Taiwan, there might be a strong reactions from Indo-Pacific countries, from Japan, from India, and from US. Of course, at this moment, probably nobody is clear how to respond to such kind of situation. And probably there is debate in China, in Tokyo right now, as I could talk to my colleagues in Tokyo. There are debates in India, there are debates in Indo-Pacific regions, debates also in Europe. Nobody is clear about how to go about it. But definitely the Chinese are taking into account that there will be severe diplomatic and political response to Chinese attack on Taiwan. Next slide, please. So I think in the context of Taiwan security, we need a greater clarity about how the Chinese are going about it and what the Indo-Pacific communities, including Japan and India, should do. And I think here it is definitely makes sense to understand China's incremental military strategy, then the gray zone warfare strategy that the Chinese are conducting for a long time, then the encroachment strategy we saw. Following Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, there was a severe encroachment strategy. Japan has been a victim of the Chinese encroachment strategy in the Senkaku Island regions for a long time. So I think India has also been a victim of the same. So I think we need to understand and take into account all of this Chinese behavior in order to prepare a case for Taiwan and to provide security. Taiwan definitely needs support from the Indo-Pacific region. Even though today we are here to say that Taiwan is having a strong defense posture to fight against mainland China, but I think definitely Taiwan needs the support of the United States of America, Japan, India, and the Quad countries. Next slides, please. And I think here we need more clarity that to what extent Japan can provide security to Taiwan and what should be Japan's future approach, what should be India's future approach, and what should be Quad's future approach. Let me share 2 minutes on each of these issues, and then I'll conclude my thought. And I think when it comes to Japan, I think there is a great level of debate among the Japan strategic thinker, and this is rightfully so, because I think PLA occupying Taiwan, definitely it is going to expose Japan's security. But I think here both Japan and the Indo-Pacific community need clarity. We are seeing that Japan is, raising its defense budget. There is a lot of defense modernization is taking place. Defense strategy, national security thinking in Japan is also under constant, upgradation. It was a huge loss for Japan that Japan lost the former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. But again, I think Prime Minister Kishida has shown a lot of positive measures to take forward Japan's national security thinking. But at the same time, I think Japan needs to engage in a bilateral and a minilateral format, more specific discussion on critical issues like Taiwan, like China-India boundary dispute, like South China Sea, with like-minded countries like India and the Quad. And I think if we talk about between Japan and India, We have discussed about the security situation. There is 2+2 dialogue between Japan and India. But again, I think the Taiwan issue would hold the defining moment. And I think, therefore, we need to have a more contingency plan between Japan and India, building a complementarity of thoughts and strategic planning. When it comes to India's stand, and I think India's stand is very critical here, even though there is a lot of cynicism about India's position on Ukraine war. And I am based there in Europe, and there is every second day I receive questions about India's position, that why India has been so silent, and why India tactically provide the support to the Russia. I don't think India provides the support to Russia. I think India's position is very clear. Official position is very clear that India does not encourage the war to continue between Russia and Ukraine. But I think here it makes sense for India to stay neutral, reserved, and cautious, not to be a part of this, war context when there is a war happening between Russia and Ukraine. But eventually, this is a war between Russia and China on the one hand, and a war between, on the other hand, European Community and NATO with the lead of US. So therefore, in this kind of situation, India would like to stay reserved and neutral. But I think on the Taiwan issue, probably, even though no matter India would like to maintain a neutral stand, but I think the time has come. India has to think a step forward, a step ahead. And I think there, India and Japan and the Quad countries needs to have a complementarity. I've been thinking about it and writing a lot about, in my writing, raising the issue. I think India cannot have the same position on the Taiwan issue. PLA occupying Taiwan, it's a great danger to India's national security, not only on the maritime domain, not only on the Bay of Bengal domain, but on the critical China-India boundary dispute. Just in 1 minute, I will explain the background of the history. The creation of Taiwan was done by the KMT, Kuomintang Party, by the Chiang Kai-shek led, Kuomintang Party, KMT Party. So the KMT's original position on China-India boundary dispute is very close to the Communist Party of China today. So therefore, if Communist Party of China, occupies Taiwan, then India will never have that upper hand of negotiation in its boundary dispute with China. Today, the mainstream two political parties in Taiwan, the DPP and the KMT, even though their position is not entirely clear on public platform, but they do express solidarity with India, and they do support India's position on China and the boundary dispute. So PLA or mainland China occupying Taiwan, it's a grave danger to India's national security, and India will be losing out the negotiation format with the Chinese when it comes to the China and the boundary dispute. What about the Quad? What should be the strategy of Quad, and how should India and Japan should take a lead about that? I think Quad's position is evolving. Quad as a platform is evolving. It is expanding. And I think it is a more open framework talking about soft security issues. But I think time has come. The Quad countries should talk about a contingency plan. Contingency plan not only on the Taiwan issues, but on a range of issues, including Senkaku Island, including China and the boundary dispute, including South China Sea. I think we need a contingency plan within the Quad. I think when we are talking about Indo-Pacific security, of course, Quad does not constitute the entire Indo-Pacific, but again, Quad's point of view on critical issues like Taiwan, on Senkaku Island, on China and the boundary dispute, including on South China Sea, will set an example for rest of the middle powers and lower income countries in the Indo-Pacific countries. So therefore, I think for the Quad countries, it makes sense to talk about the critical contingency plan on critical security issues like Taiwan, China and the boundary dispute to Senkaku Island and all. Next slides, please. And I think my last point here would be that what would be the Chinese strategy from here on, and how should we really challenge this Chinese strategy? I think the Chinese strategy would be to monitor each and every situation very closely, go in an incremental manner, step-by-step approach. They would like to, occupy the islands in the South China Sea regions, in the cross-strait regions, and then go in terms of encircling Taiwan. So I think in order to deny that, we need a credible deterrence plan. Now, there are, when we're talking about deterrence plan, deterrence is primarily probably misunderstood as entirely as a military concept. There are many angles, many aspects attached to it. I think when we're talking about building a credible deterrence plan, it could be a credible military deterrence plan, it could be a credible diplomatic deterrence plan, it could be also a credible, a politically deterrence plan. And I think there, the role of the Quad and the leadership of particularly Japan and India needs to take a front seat. We know for a fact that I think Japan has been, for a long time, has been reliant on the US. But we should not take, US action plan and commitment for a guarantee. We have seen US withdrawing from the Afghanistan regions, making the security open for, everybody. So therefore, I think seeing the US foreign policy approach currently and US economic standing, I think we need to have a much more realistic game plan here. And I think therefore, a much cohesive unity among the Asian powers, particularly with the lead of Japan and India, needs to be prepared. We need to have a more military-oriented contingency plan between Japan and India. We need to have a much more diplomatic and politically, and most importantly, economic contingency plan in terms of, diverting our supply chain networks in the Indo-Pacific. Already, Japan and India are taking a lot of, leadership role in terms of, promoting an alternative supply chain. We need to work on that, but the time has come. We need to prepare a contingency game plan in Indo-Pacific. And I stop here and thank you for your, patience and listening to me. And I welcome your comments and questions during the discussion. Thank you very much.